Pete Buttigieg is the new United States Secretary of Transportation. We're going to be talking about what that means for how all of us get around here on the NABE, Episode 4. My name is Michael Sweeney. I think most of us know Pete primarily through his 2020 presidential campaign, but I wanted to reach out and get some insight from someone who knew his actual record in office as the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. I have to admit, I'm somewhat surprised by how much I liked what I heard. Very excited to have joining me today Austin Gibble. Those of you on Twitter may know him better as Indy Austin. Austin is an Indianapolis-based transportation professional, a board member to CNU Midwest and Young Professionals in Transportation Indy, and one of the absolute best people to talk to about transportation issues in Indiana and the Midwest in general. It's going to be a bit of a shorter episode today. We're breaking the second half of our look at Secretary Pete into its own episode. Look for that in the very near future. Here is my conversation with Austin. Austin, before we get started talking about Pete Buttigieg, can you tell our audience a little bit about South Bend, Indiana as a city?
Yeah. So I think South Bend, Indiana is most widely known for Notre Dame University, private Catholic university there in northern Indiana. But the history of South Bend and South Bend itself goes far beyond Notre Dame. South Bend itself was a very industrial city, built largely around Studebaker Motors, building custom and luxury cars there in South Bend, Indiana. That was kind of their boom industry. That was the industry anchor for the city for a very long time. They left South Bend in the 60s, I believe. And that was really the big blow to South Bend in its population. It was the simultaneous 1-2 hit of disinvestment in their city, the departure of good-paying union manufacturing jobs, combined with suburban sprawl. So we started to see this emptying out of South Bend, Indiana, not uncommon to other Midwestern and Rust Belt cities, including Indianapolis, Gary, Michigan City, so on and so forth.
So this is a city that's kind of been in economic dire straits for I don't know, half a century now. It's not a recent decline, and I think maybe buoyed a little bit by having Notre Dame there, but also a lot of the same problems you would see in a city like Toledo or Flint, Michigan, or those other kind of mid-sized Rust Belt cities.
Yeah, absolutely. Although South Bend has fared a little better in terms of blunting its population loss. It's lost about 23% of its population since it peaked in 1960, compared to cities like Detroit or Cleveland or the what we call the old city of Indianapolis before the merger of the city and county, which has lost about half its population.
Gotcha. So Pete Buttigieg comes in 8 years ago as the mayor. What does his record on transportation in South Bend look like?
Yeah, he really kind of turned the tables on transportation in South Bend. He launched what is known as the Smart Streets program in South Bend, which has continued beyond his tenure as mayor. And this really took complete streets and kind of kicked it up a notch. So this takes street design and really deploys hardscape protected bikeways, better sidewalks, ADA accessibility, and all of these elements to try and prioritize pedestrians and bike riders and other vulnerable street users. Additionally, he worked to secure funding from the state, about $100 million from the Indiana State Legislature to double track the South Shore Railroad, partnering with other localities in Northwest Indiana. And
that's the railroad that runs to Chicago, right?
Correct. That is the electrified regional railroad that runs from South Bend to Chicago. That double tracking project will shave 39 minutes off of travel time between South Bend and Chicago. And it's one of the more notable electrified rail projects in the United States going on outside of California.
In the 21st century, cities really rise and fall based on connectivity. Connectivity is the new currency for cities. And we're proud to be connected digitally, we're proud to be connected culturally. Now we got to do a little more to make sure that we're connected infrastructurally. In order to fully unlock the potential of being located where we're located, we really need to connect up to that rail link and make it as fast as it can be. And when we have first-rate service connecting us to Chicago every day by rail, that's a big deal. That's a big deal for families, that's a big deal for business, and it's really going to help us continue to grow at a moment when we're growing like we haven't in a generation.
So I think a lot of people have portrayed Buttigieg as like this transportation neophyte who doesn't really belong at DOT, but that sounds like a pretty in the weeds rail project to champion as mayor.
Yeah, and he never quite was able to implement it during his tenure, but he also laid the groundwork to bring South Shore back into downtown South Bend. It was a street running interurban line into downtown until the 80s, I believe. And then the terminus was moved out to the South Bend airport. There's now currently an effort to bring it back into downtown following the Norfolk Southern right of way. And that would be great for integration with local transit. It would be great for downtown economic development, and downtown South Bend has just been gutted over the last several decades. But I think that's Pete's advantage when it comes to leading up USDOT, is that he's been on the ground, he's been in these localities and knows exactly kind of how these efforts at the local level work. And I think that's going to be his strong suit.
Yeah, he's kind of been on the consumer side's not the right word, but he's been on the a lot of times states and local governments are kind of going to DOT with needs and requests, and he's been on that side of it a lot more than a typical DOT secretary would have been.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we see that strength. We saw that strength with Secretary Anthony Fox as well, who was previously the mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, working really closely with local governments to meet their needs in terms of transportation funding and transportation projects.
So beyond just his ability to work with local governments, how would you expect his experience as mayor to translate to USDOT?
I think one thing that we're going to see is more of a focus on pushing funding directly towards local governments rather than going through states. That has been historically a pretty big challenge with a lot of localities when states distribute transportation dollars from the federal government, and it's largely prioritized for highways. We're going to see, I think, a lot more dollars pushed towards local improvements, pedestrian improvements, bike improvements, local streets dollars, transit dollars, through either directly to cities and counties or perhaps to metropolitan planning organizations.
So I think especially like the context of Buttigieg having been a Democratic mayor in a red state, and under, I guess, half his mayorship was under Trump with the Republican administration also, like that makes a lot of sense that he would be really focused on working with local governments instead of state governments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially with that blue city, red state dynamic. The Indiana state legislature has historically not been friendly towards public transportation funding. There's been some challenges with the state circumventing local efforts to improve transit. And I think that Pete Buttigieg being a part of this coalition that was able to work with the state of Indiana and secure a significant match for the South Shore project, not only for double tracking, but the state has also committed towards a branch extension down to Dyer and expanding electric regional rail in Indiana, is quite significant.
In addition to his direct transportation record, Pete Buttigieg's record on other transportation adjacent issues like housing or the environment, what does that tell us about how you expect him to be as the transportation secretary?
Yeah, Pete has There's been some criticism of Pete Buttigieg's approach to housing. But South Bend, much like a lot of cities in Indiana, have seen a lot of displacement through disinvestment. We have a lot of housing stock that is simply unfit for human habitation. And there was a program that's not exactly uncommon in the Midwest, where houses that can't be repaired are demolished.
But, and as you said, I mean, the population is down over 20% from its peak. So it makes sense that there are, just there's no reason to build new houses except to replace old houses that can't be inhabited anymore.
Mm-hmm. There was certainly some criticism about how the approach was done, how the homes that were rehabbed, how the neighborhoods were approached as these homes were demolished or rehabilitated. Not necessarily, he didn't have, I don't think, nefarious intent or malice intent with with the program by any stretch of the imagination. But there was some criticism from circles outside of South Bend and some inside that the efforts accelerated gentrification. But I think it's important to look at gentrification in the context of the economic standing of South Bend. Not saying that gentrification isn't a problem. It certainly is. But disinvestment is also a problem. I think a lot of people view South Bend just through the lens of Notre Dame and see it as a college town, much like Bloomington, Indiana, where housing is much more expensive. Disinvestment isn't as much of a problem, and the problems in Bloomington largely stem around housing affordability.
So, what was the impact of the Smart Streets program that Pete Buttigieg implemented as mayor of South Bend?
Yeah, I don't have direct data offhand showing that there was that X number of crashes reduced. But what we do see in downtown South Bend is not just downtown South Bend, although some of the largest infrastructure investments have been in downtown. There's a significant investment in improving the safety for pedestrians and bike riders at traffic signals, reducing flying rights or the slip lanes, as they're also called, implementing very robust protected bike lanes. So instead of just, there are bike lanes that have the flex posts, but in downtown South Bend, they're also separated by tree medians, and they're separated and clearly marked from the sidewalk. So just a very strong, low stress biking and pedestrian environment. Also geared towards making downtown South Bend a place that businesses and residents would like to live in, versus just driving in, doing your work, and then leaving.
Yeah, I think especially like in context of someone who came in 8 years ago, that's a pretty progressive and forward-looking way to be doing your downtown, and fits pretty well within his choice of deputy in Polly Trottenberg, the New York City Transportation Commissioner, who was doing a lot of that stuff in New York as well. But I think people don't always think about that with a city like South Bend.
Yeah, and he was surprisingly progressive or not surprisingly progressive. He's a very progressive individual, but also taking on some of the challenges relating to land use and making ADUs by right, auxiliary dwelling units by right throughout the city. And just last week, South Bend, although he's no longer mayor, you kind of see this momentum continuing, and South Bend eliminated parking minimums citywide, which is, I know, the ire of many transportation planners and land use planners alike. I would say that I'm very, very excited to see what comes out of USDOT and what comes out of this administration. I know that at least within kind of the more progressive urbanist circles, there was hope that someone who had a bit more of an aggressive agenda would be selected. But I think that Pete Buttigieg's experience at the local level when it comes to transportation planning and when it comes to really laying the groundwork for getting things done, I think that's going to be very exciting. And really the head of USDOT is someone who knows how to work to get deals done. They know how to work and get things through. The real policy wonks work at Federal Transit Administration, Federal Highway Administration. And I think that's where we see individuals like Polly Trottenberg come in, who are really going to be doing some of the nitty gritty to change some of the policies within USDOT among its various administrations. But overall, I think that this is going to be a very interesting 4 years. I'm very excited to see what comes out of it. And I really wish the best for Mayor Pete. I know he has the best intentions in mind, and he's a big thinker, and I can't wait. Now, I do have I'm a little biased because I live in Indiana and I work in transportation in Indiana, but it helps to have someone on the inside.
Yeah, I mean, and I think something that you saw a lot online, and I was guilty of this myself when they announced him as the choice, was, this is like, he was promised this in exchange for his endorsement, and this is just, a B-level cabinet role for them to stick him at. But the more I've been able to listen to like transportation professionals or people who are familiar with his record, the more encouraged I've been. And this actually seems like it's a pretty good fit for him.
Yeah, I very much agree.
All right. Well, Austin, thank you so much for joining me. This has been extremely enlightening.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been super exciting. And it's the first time I've been able to talk about Mayor Pete. And honestly, probably the first time I've been on a podcast recently where it hasn't been a little bit doom and gloom. What are we going to do?
Some rays of optimism coming through finally.
Yes, there is light. Yeah, I think if anyone is interested in learning more about some of the transportation projects that are happening in Indiana, they're more than welcome to reach out to me at austingibble@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at Indy_Austin. I know Indiana kind of falls, it's not exactly high profile in terms of transportation projects, but we did just open the country's first all-electric BRT line here in Indianapolis, and we're about to build 2 more. So it's a very exciting time to be working in what is not typically a state in the limelight that has suddenly been pushed into focus at the national level for a lot of different reasons.
Well, thank God for Mayor Pete, right?
Yes.
Thank you again to Austin Gibble for coming on the show. I also want to mention, and you may have noticed the audio on this recording was a little bit messy. There's a baby in the background. There's a dog in the background. So my apologies about that. We're working on making this show better and making our audio quality better. I also wanted to extend my heartfelt appreciation to Austin for putting up with several interruptions from my dog during the recording of this episode. Thank you, as always, for watching. I want to hear from you. The show is new. We're still figuring out what we're doing. So if you have a comment or suggestion, the easiest way for us to see it is to comment on the YouTube video or to tweet at us at The NABE Show or to me at MTSW. I read all feedback. It does help us make the show better. Also, remember to subscribe to the feed. We are on YouTube. We are on Apple Podcasts. We're on Google Podcasts. We're on Spotify. Make sure you subscribe and you'll get notified whenever there's a new episode. Subscribing is 100% free and it helps us grow our audience. Next time on The NABE, it's the second half of our Secretary Pete 2-parter. If today was a little bit of a retrospective on Pete's time in Indiana, next time we'll be looking at what's on the agenda for federal transportation policy in the Biden administration. We'll be talking to Motherboard's Aaron W. Gordon. Looking forward to Pete's time in the federal government and a little bit of New York City transit talk sprinkled in there as well. Mayor Pete is now the fulcrum on which all transportation policy in this great nation turns, and we at The NABE will be covering all of it. I hope to see you next time.